Hi, my name is Alexis Miniat, and my research revolves around the idea of presidents speaking green. So in 2019, the United Nations reported that we have 11 years until there is irreversible damage done to our environment by something that you all are very familiar with, climate change resulting from the burning of fossil fuels, which has and will continue to present a multitude of negative effects to our Earth. And as we are in the 11th hour of fixing this issue, of slowing down this timer, it becomes important to look at what our national governments are doing to fix it, especially that of the United States, who in 2020, by the Yale Environmental Performance Index, was put as 24th, well behind other industrialized nations, for the inability to manage our waste. And so when we're looking at environmentalism in the United States, the forefront of this academic conversation is that of public opinion. What is causing those shifts in what people are believing? And Gallup, who is known for their ability to do these national surveys, released in 2008 a historical analysis of many different questions beyond just this one, which measures if people believe that the effects of global warming have already begun. But throughout all of these questions, there was a very clear trend, that of partisanship. So as you can see here in the red, the Republican Party versus the blue, the Democratic Party. In 1997, there is a 4% difference. By 2008, we're looking at more than 30% difference between these two parties. And this is beyond just this question. In all of these, we see about a 15 to a 25% mean difference between the two parties. So what does this indicate? Is this the reason for the lack of action on our national government? And while there could be many reasons for why this division is happening, our primary question should be, is this division impacting environmentalism on the national scale? And so in order to look at environmentalism in the United States, we should be looking at the president, our top politician, and their role in pushing environmental policy. And this is done through case studies, most notably that of Sussman and Daines, who through their research look at 4 of the most environmentally related presidents. And what they find is that there are many ways to push this policy. They can, support individual different bills. They can support different candidates. And this happens, this ability to talk to the people happens through their oral addresses and statements. And as we know since the time of Aristotle, the rhetoric within these speeches has the power to transform the minds of the masses. And Dr. Adam Lawrence confirmed this in his research when he shows that the President's State of the Union address impacts public mind and media coverage for 6 months after the event. And Mildenberg and Lesowitz try to find a reason for these changes. What is causing climate change to change in public mind over time? And they measure against the variable of the economy, the state of our country at the time. And while they don't see a relationship between public opinion shifting and the economy, they do see in their historical content analysis that maybe it's our political cues from the elite, from people like the President of the United States. And so all of this research indicates that we need to be looking at our presidents and their importance in these movements on the national scale. And so Arthur and Woods attacked this in the field of immigration rhetoric when looking at these negative framed immigration speeches compared to different variables. The most important of those for my own research is that of partisanship, the control of who's controlling the government. Is the government divided? And what they see is that while there isn't a relationship between those increasing negative frames and the immigration rhetoric, they do find that presidents are more likely to use these negative frames when the government is not divided. And so all of these foundational sources in my research, they all point to a very clear gap. From Mildenberg's need to study the political cues in our presidents influencing social movements, to need of Arthur and Woods' study in the field of immigration rhetoric, the relationship between the environmental speeches of our presidents and partisanship needs to be established. Which leads to my research question. To what extent have the past 50 years of environmental rhetoric references in our presidents correlated with partisanship in our nation? And before we get into that, there are 2 things that we need to know. The first of these is political divide, which simply put are the differences between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And the second one of this is how I'm measuring this polarization in our country. It's the divided government measure, when the President of the United States and Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, are not of the same party. And so why 50 years? Why is 50 years my timeline for my research question? It's for two reasons. The first of these being that in 1970, arguably one of the most important years to a national environmentalism, something's created, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency by Richard Nixon, which still regulates environmental policy to this day. And in that timeline right after, the 50 years following, I'm addressing the modern conversation of environmentalism that we're not getting yet from those case studies. It's lacking in this field. And I'm getting a very large demographic of presidents. They are Republican, they're Democratic, they come from different backgrounds, different places in the world, and they're all on the scale, right, of Republican to Democratic, they vary, allowing my conversation of my thematic analysis to be a very rich one. And so my hypothesis, despite Arthur and Wood's not finding a relationship between immigration rhetoric and our presidents and partisanship, I believe that because of those Gallup surveys that indicate such a clear divide in our nation, that if there is no party divide between the President of the United States and Congress, then we're going to be able to make more references. And this is because when our government is united, more policy action can be happening. And so to address this hypothesis and my question, I begin with two different methodologies. The first of these being a content analysis, and that's because of those important findings by Dr. Adam Lawrence and and the case studies by people like Sussman and Daines, who found important similarities and differences between our presidents. But in order to do this, I needed to get a strong sample size of speeches and statements as they're related to the environment. And so to begin this, that had to be identified through a set terms list on the American Presidency Project database that Arthur and Woods used in their own research. To identify these speeches, you had to basically make a search term list that you would put in a Google search engine. And how I did this was the American Environmental Protection Agency annually does a report on the environment. And in this report on the environment, there were, in 2020, about 150 different terms as they related to the American conversation of environmentalism. And I framed these into the 6 different main themes of the United Nations Environmental Program. And I put 3 of each of those Environmental Protection Agency terms into each of those categories, making a very diverse set of words and search terms for my research, which put the American conversation of environmentalism into the scope of the global effort which it truly should be about. And out of those speeches, out of the 11,000 that were in my initial study group, I was able to go through these, comb which ones are actually environmentally related, and I'll get to in a second why that couldn't have been, why that is a variable. I noted their stance towards the specific issues. When they said climate change, what were they actually talking about? Not necessarily was it negative or positive, but what were they supporting? And this is followed almost simultaneously by a correlational analysis. Because of what Arthur and Woods did in their field of immigration, I tried to mimic that methodology by doing the percentage of environmental records in those times of undivided government versus those in a divided government. And by measuring those different proportions and using a 2-prop z-test to see that difference, I will be able to measure if it is significant. Does the situation in our country is that causing a difference in our presidents, how often they're being able to speak about these, balanced by my content analysis, which says, what are they really saying? And so my research, out of the about 7,000 speeches that actually ended up being environmentally related, out of those we see some pretty clear trends. In these little green shaded areas, very light if you can't see them, I'm sorry, but that's when we have an undivided government in our nation, which obviously doesn't happen very often, but that's democracy for you. And so in these spaces, in that first decade when I was doing my research, I was very hopeful about my hypothesis. What we see here is Carter's presidency, despite him being in a time of maybe some economic unrest, he doubles in his references to the environment. Not only is he a Democratic president, which could be indicated by those Gallup surveys as influencing this, but his undivided government doubles between that after Ford. However, when I went on into my research of finally getting to a point of seeing an undivided government again, looking at Clinton's first year in the presidency, it increased only slightly relative to the years around him. We see that, it's less than 2% difference between him and himself in that later dot, which points to the fact that my statistical analysis showed that there wasn't a relationship between the division of our government and what presidents, or how often presidents were saying these things, which proves that I can't reject my null hypothesis that there was not a relationship between the two. And while this wasn't what my hypothesis suggested, it's not unexpected because of those results by Arthur and Woods, which said that in the field of immigration, there's not a relationship to the rhetoric in our presidents. However, my thematic findings indicated, it actually broke some misconceptions that I had about the national level of environmentalism because of those Gallup surveys. And maybe it indicated some relationships that we're not already seeing in the academic conversation of environmental rhetoric in our presidents. And this is seen through three of the main trends that were the most reoccurring in our presidents. These trends happened in almost every single month that I analyzed for the president's first and last time in office. And the first of these is a balance between the economy and the environment. So as the economy was stressed, especially in the time of Ford, Reagan, and George W. Bush, who happened to be Republican presidents, even when there was a need to push other measures, right? Even if we needed to focus on gas or focus on not spending excess money into environmental policy, they still referenced it. They balanced it out by saying, maybe we can't do this now, but in a couple of years, we're going to be able to do this. At the end of my term, we will be working on renewable energy, which is really important because maybe those conversations, maybe that divide that we're seeing in those Gallup surveys about the divide in our nation, it doesn't correlate to what our presidents are saying. And then this kind of follows the same trend as the trend in energy. Presidents, when under this time of stress, when we're having a fuel shortage or gas prices are really high, once again, in those times of Ford, Reagan, and George W. Bush, they have to focus on clean natural gas or oil. They want to supply more pipelines, create more pipelines to transport that oil into the United States. And while they still make references to renewable energy, right, they still support nuclear, most presidents do, wind, solar especially, and sometimes Reagan threw in a little geothermal. What they were saying was, once again, even though that they couldn't do those measures now, they had to focus on energy independence, a very important phrase that was used between all of these presidents. They needed to find energy independence from other countries to sustain our own economy and energy systems that were already pre-established. However, when making these references and still saying that we'll do the renewable energy down the line, they balance this out with really every other thing under the realm of environmentalism. The third of these trends is environmental protection. And what we see in our presidents is that, maybe even despite these times of economic stress, of energy stress, the presidents are supporting land conservation, at least to a degree. They all want to reduce greenhouse gases. They all make references in each of their terms that I studied that they want to raise fuel efficiency. Part of that energy goal is that they need to raise that fuel efficiency. They need to reduce the emissions, or they need to heighten the emissions testing in our vehicles and reduce the greenhouse gases. There's really everything else. They need to protect endangered species for biodiversity. And all of these trends, from the energy to the balance to environmental protection, indicate that maybe our presidents aren't so different as we would say because, the Republican Party maybe lacks a platform of environmentalism on the national scale. And like all research, mine had its limitations. The first of these is that the American Presidency Project that I used was not a true Boolean search. For example, words that I pulled up like water quality, looked up every speech that had the word water in it and every speech that had the word quality in it, which, as you would know, maybe made my search term list or speeches about 1,000 or 11,000 long when I began. However, it also brought up in a few different subjects, right? So Watergate was brought up a lot, for those of you who are familiar with that topic. And environmental emergencies cause more references. But this really did just expand the scope of my thematic analysis by making that more rich. What conversations are we having during these times? And then the environmental measure that Arthur and Woods used in their research. For each of these immigration speeches, they were able to categorize them as pro and anti. For my own research, I didn't have access to 12 coders like they did. It was me, a singular researcher. And so I kind of circumnavigated this by looking at what policy are they supporting during these references. And then the first and last, let me go back for a second. That could have led my thematic analysis to see more similarities. That's really why this one's important. Because if we were looking at pro and anti, it would have led to see those more differences. And then the last of these is that the first and last year of each president's time in office was measured in not all 50 for the efficiency of me, but by looking at the first and last year, I was still able to examine any changes during their time in office. And so while my research showed no significant relationship between that of partisanship in our nation and those environmental references, my thematic analysis and those in the study of Arthur and Woods indicate that their economical status of our country at the time could be large contextualization for what's causing an increase or decrease in these references. And my research, because of being able to do this through the thematic analysis, is vital. It's vital to this academic conversation because even though I didn't find a relationship, I removed one of the 1,000 light bulbs that Thomas Edison did before he found the one that solved a huge crisis. And as we are in the 11th hour, as we are seeing these sea level risings, as we're seeing communities with health pollution issues, it's important to be looking at this, to find that light bulb that's going to make our nation care about the environment. Thank you.
All right, oral defense, you may start your questions.
Alexis, how did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
So when I began my research, knowing that the public opinion was the largest conversation in the academic field, I originally wanted to look at polarization through that lens. But when I was going through that, especially being in AP Stats, we realized that there's a lot of fallacies in looking in national surveys. There's a lot of faults that we can see in those. And so especially some studies that proved that Gallup maybe wasn't the best source. And so instead, I changed my conversation. I tried to find some different methodologies. And going across finding Arthur and Woods' studies, I realized that there was a completely different way of measuring polarization that made my research maybe even more rich in the thematic analysis. And so to counteract me focusing really now on a very, very quantitative data, that percent of environmental references in each of those different political situations, I had to counteract that with a thematic analysis to measure, not just how many times the president's saying something, but what it's important, what are they saying? And so I think that was probably the biggest shift in my process, resulting from seeing more sources in the field.
All right, Alexis, how do your findings provide directions for future research in the field?
So my research indicating that there's not a relationship, right? I was talking about in my presentation that while I wasn't able to prove that statistical relationship, it shows through my thematic analysis that there's a strong economy push. And I think that finding in particular kind of build off of what Mildenberg and Lesserwitz were able to see. They didn't see a relationship between the economy and public opinion, but maybe expanding on that conversation, maybe there is a relationship between the economy and environmental presidents, maybe even the economy and the environmental policy that they're supporting at the time.
And if you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
Well, considering if I can still have the same amount of time, I would expand time, first of all. But if I had to keep the same time consistency, what I would do actually is what Arthur and Woods did. They actually lessened the amount of speeches they were looking at so they could really delve into these speeches and find these really strong thematic findings. And I would increase the variables so that I wasn't just looking at the contextualization of the division in our nation, but maybe I could answer, is the economy really impacting our president's speeches? Is the audience they're speaking in front of impacting our speeches? And I think that by addressing these questions, my research could have put a further dent into this conversation because of that important timeline that we're fighting against.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's open the floor for additional questions.
This is off now. Yes, Dominic.
So are you saying you think that with like a rise in like a better economy, there are more environmental policies? Or
Yeah, so there's two different sides of that. I would say that when I saw that the economy, based on what the presidents were saying, right? So all of my research, it didn't go further than that. I was looking purely what the presidents were saying. During that time of those economic declines, I actually saw an increase in the references of presidents speaking about the environment because they were causing more policy which was negatively impacting it. But I do think that the policy side of your question, right, the economic, if our economy is bad, I think that we're going to see less environmental policy. At least in how they're how they're crossing each other out, right? For every environmental policy we do, if we make one about oil, we're really just, there's a negative, positive equals nothing. So I would say that the economy is going to impact the environmental policy negatively, but it's actually impacting what our presidents are saying positively because they're talking more about environmental standards. Are there any other questions? Yes, Ms. Grafton.
How does this play into what you plan to do in the future?
A big number right here. So I want to go into political science, right, with a minor in environmental studies, which is exactly why I pursued this. When I actually did my interview with WashU, not going there, but when I did my interview with WashU, there was a student who was talking about a class that actually starts to begin to answer this question, our differences and the similarities in our presidents and the environmental policy. And I fell in love with that idea, right? I fell in love in this first interview of, maybe we can make an impact by just knowing what presidents are going to say in response to how our nation is. And so I really want to keep exploring this when I go into college. At Sewanee, I will be looking at political science and hoping to go into law after that. So it's a big deal. This is a really big deal for me.
Your passion shifts.
Well, I'm glad.
Well suited.
Castles.
So, maybe the teacher, that the graph that you showed that showed the divergence in the parties.
Yes.
Really interesting. I think you're onto something with this presidential rhetoric, but I don't think you can stop the president. I would be really interested, and I'm kind of asking if you looked at this or saw this, is there an increase in rhetoric? Is there an increase in, what's the word I'm looking for? The severity of the rhetoric by the Democrats, right, 2000, 2004, somewhere in there, right? Because that's about where you start to see that split. The Republicans don't follow, because the Republicans are right there, mid-40s, kind of the whole way across.
Yep.
And the Democrats are really spiky. Is there did you notice anything?
Actually, yes. There's an amazing paper that I encourage you all to read about the apocalyptic nature of environmental rhetoric in our presidents, especially in the Democratic Party. And what they're saying, especially in the turn of the century, after 2000, the case studies usually focus on presidents earlier than the 2000s. But in that paper, it talks about that we are increasing, right, as our timeline is getting closer. It's more end days, end doom. And I think that could be causing, my research doesn't specifically address that. And Arthur and Woods weren't able to do that. And how it's filled, right? We're looking at those quantitative variables. But I would be interested to see if that really is resulting in some changes in that public opinion.
Because it definitely follows political political rhetoric in this country.
Yes.
And in all topics, right? Not just environmentalism, everything's a big deal. Every election, whether it's
Yeah.
presidential election or midterm, is the election of our lifetime, right? And we hear that over and over, and anyways.
Yeah. No. I think it really would be an interesting study, just because, and when I went through all of these presidents, a lot of them didn't use the really negative framings. We just learned about something in AP Lit talking about how we maybe do understatements by, trying to make a hyperbole. It doesn't really matter. But, but a lot of these presidents focused on your grandchildren are not going to have da-da-da-da. Your grandchildren are not going to have clean air to breathe. And so I think that that's the apocalyptic nature that we're looking at. And you would only see those effects later down in the trends, which I think is why it's important that I address modern presidents, because that's those trends, the negative framing is only going to impact the next public poll, right? So, yeah. Any more questions?
I have some questions.
Okay.
I would like to hear what you found with regard to global warming, the rhetoric of global warming versus the rhetoric of climate change. You, if you're old like me, you remember the time when you heard about the hole in the ozone layer.
Yeah.
And the world's going to burn up, the world's going to burn up, and so on and so forth. And so there was apocalyptic rhetoric then too. How has the conversation changed from global warming to climate change? Was there a change? Because you hear that argument from other sides of the environmental policy that it's just a change. Did you see a difference in that as you did yourself?
So global warming wouldn't have fallen into one of my search terms, but what I did see was in the speeches, they were almost used synonymously, really starting with Bush Sr. That's when climate change and global warming really became important in their speeches, which was surprising, right? Because you would think like Nixon would be a person who would want to talk about those things, but I think that our research is more solidified. I did not see a change in those references, but that's probably because global warming, neither of those terms were in my searches.
And I think we could probably talk more in depth about that at a later time, because I'd like to investigate that a little
Yeah.
more with you. But you made a two more questions. The first one is, you said that the initial search was 11,000 speeches, reduced down to 7,000 speeches. So as a researcher, as a student who's on a timeline, who works on this, you work on it obviously more than just that 1 hour a day, but you have 1 hour dedicated to it when you're here at school. How did you bite into those 7,000 speeches without being overwhelmed?
I don't know. I think that I was overwhelmed. I mean, teachers can speak for me walking into the class and be like, kind of just like hyperventilating at how much I felt that I still had to do. I bit on the work of 12 different coders, what they were able to accomplish. But what I tried to do, so actually using the American Presidency Project database kind of helped me with this. So when you look up the search terms on the website, each of the speeches and statements that arise from that search, it bolds the words that are in that speech in particular. So it works like a desktop search. And so by doing that, by searching for those words in particular, I read, and the reason why, I wish that, if I had done less speeches to analyze more, I did more review of these speeches. So I looked at the paragraph before, the paragraph after, and then the paragraph in which that reference was situated, and that really helped me to get through all of these, because I just focused purely on especially like where that's happening, which may have influenced my results, right? Because that president could speak really, really great about the environment and then be like, but we're going to make 5 different pipelines coming into the United States. But I think that really helped me, is being able to say, like, I know that I'm not going to keep reading about these gas tax prices, because I know that this is what the president's going to keep talking about. Being able just to make that distinction for myself and prioritize.
The great thing about this class and what you guys are doing is you have to problem solve like that. I'd love to hear how you guys overcame obstacles in your research. So my last one is more personal to you. Mm-hmm. You made the comment in your presentation today that Republicans may not have a national platform on environmentalism. Mm-hmm. How did you biased? Because to me, that initially sounds like a biased statement.
Yeah.
I don't know where that came from. Is there evidence that Republicans don't have a national platform compared to Democrats? I don't know the answer to
Yeah.
that. That's why I'm asking you. But how did you, to me, that sounds biased. So how did you keep your personal bias out of your research?
Ryan and I actually had this conversation. I kept it out I wrote down quotes of what presidents said around those references that I thought, so for example, when we're talking about the gas tax prices, I just analyzed what policy they were supporting, what superfund they said, which country do we want to align ourselves with. So I think that's how I tried to. I stayed away from the pro and anti. As like the people who know me walking through this presentation, I really, really wanted to do the pro and anti because I'm really strong politically. But I knew that I couldn't do that. Ryan is not like I was not able to keep that barrier if I did pro and anti. And so I did the circumnavigating, just looking at the policy, what they were actually saying versus is this a good or a bad thing? And the platform actually so the Democratic Party has like an environmental on their website, an environmental slide, whereas the Republican Party kind of skits around it, which is where I get that from. Yeah.
All right, nicely done.